hey there guys, and welcome back. On this week's show, it's part 6 of Dutchy Patterns Forklift build. Well, it's hard to believe that we're at part 6. I can hardly believe it myself. I really didn't think it was going to take this long, but I'm enjoying the process and it's been a really great build so far, and I hope that you're enjoying it as well. When we left off on last week's show, we just got the wheels finished and got them mounted onto the forklift. So it's looking great. Let's head over to the bench and see what this week has in store for us. Well, we're going to start working on the steering, and I've made my steering wheel. I've kind of done my own thing here. You can use a purchased one, or you can make your own like what I've done here. I've made this a little beefier with no cutouts here because of the functional steering. I want this to be a little more durable. Now, if you don't want to do my style here, like this, which was turned on the lathe, you can follow the patterns and cut one out like what Dutchy has suggested, or, as I said, you can use a pre-made store-bought one. I also have made these pins, 4 of them here. There's one over on the bench, and I've made the rear steering piece. Guys, this is just a matter of following the dimensions on the pattern. So I've placed a clear plastic washer here, which is just my preference. And the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to glue this rear steering piece onto the shaft that we installed earlier. Well, I've made the second steering piece, which is basically a 5/16 diameter dowel with some holes drilled in it. And I have it just dry fit on the dowel for my steering column. And I'm just going to feed this up through the middle here. And I'm going to glue my steering wheel in place on the opposite side. I'm then going to let that completely set up. And now with the steering wheel dry, we're going to make sure that it's flush with our steering column. We're going to hold it in place, and we're going to glue this dowel piece in place. Now for me, I have a plastic washer there, and it's 100% up to you if you want to add one of those to your model. Now I have some 3/32 diameter dowels that are sharpened to a point on one end. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this string tight, and we're going to apply some glue, and I'm going to insert these pins into this back section and let the glue set up. And we will do the exact same thing on the front. We're going to pull these tight, get some tension on them. I'm going to try to tie this. I don't think it's going to work very well. This is pretty slippery string. But we're going to try to tie it, knot it off, and get some tension on it. And then get those sharpened dowels put in so that they can really take the brunt of the tension here. Okay, so we're going to get that tensioned up as much as we can, and then install the dowels to hold them in place. And you can now further tension your strings by adding these 4 pins. And you can see here that by turning our steering wheel, our steering at the back is functional. So that's very cool. Very cool. And there we go. That is the steering done. I'm going to play around with the tension of it a little bit. I think I can get that functioning just a little better. It's not bad now, but I think that we can do better on that. So I'm going to play with the tension and see how we make out. Well, guys, this is pretty much it for this. There's a few trim pieces here that need to go on. We'll get to those, but I think it's time that we start on the forks. Well, guys, just before we move on to the forks, I just want to point out something to you. I completely stopped filming because I wasn't happy with the steering. You can see the pieces where I cut out all of the steering mechanisms that I had. And what I didn't like was the amount of flex that was in this 3/16 diameter dowel. So I got rid of it, and I put a 1/4 inch dowel in here, which makes the steering function much better. I like the way that works a lot better. It doesn't have as much flex in it. It doesn't feel like it's going to break. So I think my point here is, if you're not happy with something, change it. If you're not completely happy, remake it. because you're the only one here that you have to please for this. Okay, so with that being said, now we can move on to the forks. Now guys, starting here on page 41 is the assembly of the forks. Now guys, I'm not going to get too much into this because I really don't think it needs a lot of explanation. These are square pieces, some with a dado cut out. This is just a square block with a little bit of a chamfer on it. This is a square with a hole cut in it. I mean, this is not rocket science. Any of these pieces are not difficult to make. So I'm going to get all of our square pieces cut, and then we can look at the assembly of the frame. But what I am going to show you what to do is we're going to look at this piece here. This one here, 19F, we may need a left and a right. That can be a little confusing, so we're going to run through this one. But for now, go through all of the drawings here showing the inner mast, the outer mast, all of these pieces, and get them all cut. Guys, they're simple cuts, they're squares. So get them all cut and we can move on from there. So we have all of the straight pieces cut for our outer mast. Now for this, there's nothing tricky. You just need to make sure that for this piece 19A that you have a left and a right. They need to be opposite. So you can use the assembly drawing and use that to assemble this section. Well, these pieces 19F look much harder than what they are to make. So what I have is I have a piece of walnut that is 11 millimeters thick. Now, we want to pay attention here to grain orientation because I think that's where this piece is going to have its strength. And if you deviate from the grain orientation, I think we're going to have problems. So I think I would like the grain to run this way along our piece. So that would mean it goes like this. So what I've done is I've taken the pattern and I have placed it onto a piece of hardboard and I've cut it out, including drilling our hole. So the very first thing that we want to do is I want to line this up on our board. We're going to make a left and a right. So we're going to line this up. I'm going to use a square to make sure that it lines up with the edge, just like that. And we're going to trace it onto our stock, remembering that we need a left and the right. So after we get the first one traced out, we're going to flip our template over and trace the second one. And there we go. It may be hard to see on the walnut, but we have them both traced out. So here's the thing. The next thing that we want to do is we need to measure from this edge to this line right here. You really don't have to measure because if you look here, it says this is 13 to this line, it's 26 across, which means that this has to be 13. So up from the bottom of our piece here, because that is the orientation, we are going to place a mark 13 millimeters up and we're going to draw a square line right across our piece. All right, so at this point in time now, we want to drill our holes. Now we mark them with our template, so we're just going to center punch them and drill our holes in both of our pieces. Well, the next thing that we want to do, guys, is I want to cut the perimeter of our pieces. However, you want to stop at that line right here at 13 millimeters. Do not cut this top section out. And we're just going to do those cuts over at the scroll saw. Well, you can see I have those cut just up to that line, and now we're going to head over to this table saw. And what I've done is I've installed a dado blade here, and we're going to set the fence so that it strikes right at that line at 13 millimeters. And what we're going to do is cut these rabbets that will form this one tongue here on our piece 19F. One of these rabbets is 3 millimeters deep and one is 4 millimeters deep. So with the same fence setting, we can just use our dado blade, raise it up to 4 millimeters to cut our second one after we get our 3 millimeter one cut. And you should end up with something that looks like this. And now to finish off these pieces, we're going to take them over to the scroll saw and finish off our cuts around the rest of the perimeter of our piece. And it doesn't take long before you will have a left and a right of those brackets. Now guys, I know that with this metric system here in these set of plans, there are a lot of friends of mine over in Europe that are going to want to make this, and you're going to tell me that you don't have access to a dado blade, and that's quite okay. You can use your router table with a straight cut bit, just raise it the same as what I did with the dado blade to 3 millimeters on the one side, 4 millimeters on the other, and if you want you can take light passes, but you just set your fence so that the edge of the blade strikes right at that 13 millimeter mark. So at this point, with those pieces done now, we can finish assembling our entire outer mast section. And before too long, you have your outer mast done, and that looks great. You just want to make sure, guys, while you're gluing it up, that we have square corners all the way around. You want this perfectly square because this mates with the inner mast, and they will slide and work together. Now, starting at page 45, and for the next 4 pages, 46, 47, and 48, we have a whole host of different parts to make the inner mast. It's the same process as what we did for the outer mast. Page 48 actually starts the mast slide unit, and we have a couple pieces here that are just square blocks, so we're not going to get into making those. But guys, do the same process, make your inner mast, make the mast slide unit, and then we're going to turn our attention to this piece. And I'll show you how I think would be the best way to go about making this piece. It looks difficult, but it's not. At this point, I have both my inner and outer mast made, glued together. It's just a dry fit right now. Nothing is actually glued to the model. Now I also have our mast slide unit done. And guys, this is just simple square cuts with simple dados on each side. You can see them on the plans. You can follow the plans, follow the dimensions, and make this piece. But as I said earlier, we're going to get into this mast slide unit here, the other half of it. And what I have is I have a piece of walnut. It is 8 millimeters thick, and I have cut the rabbet that is required. You can see it right here. That is 4 millimeters wide, 9 millimeters deep, and I have that cut in this entire length. Now this length is enough to make both of our pieces. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to cut these to their final length of 140, but do not cut their width yet. Well, we can now take one of these pieces and put aside, and that will be this section right here. But we want to concentrate on this piece with the holes. And I was actually looking at it a little backwards. These holes, the center of them is at the edge of this board right at the rabbet here. So they're like a half circle all the way along the top. But that's not how we want to do this. So I'm actually going to elongate this rabbet. I'm going to cut it back about another 3 to 4 millimeters over at the table saw using a dado blade, and that way we'll have more room to work. And then I'll show you what we want to do from there. And it doesn't take long to make that rabbet just a little bit deeper. So what we're going to do is, we know that here on the drawing it shows a 9 millimeter rabbet. That's what this should be. That's what this one is. That also will be the top of our board, which also will be the center of each one of these holes. So what I'm going to do is, from this shoulder here of our rabbet, we're going to measure out 9 millimeters. We're going to draw a line right across. I'm going to lay out all of these holes here that are listed. They are a 3 millimeter diameter hole, and we are going to drill all 8 of these holes on this piece right along our line at 9 millimeters. And with that, we're going to take this over to the table saw. We're going to set our fence so that our blade cuts right on that line. And once we get that cut done, we will then cut both of our pieces to their final width of 18 millimeters. And there we have our two pieces. Now there are some 45 chamfers right here. You can see them all the way around on both pieces. We're going to set our miter fence. We're going to cut those over at the table saw. We're going to give these two pieces a good sanding. And then if we look here at our drawing, we're going to glue them in place, making sure that they're perfectly centered here along our other assembly that we made a little earlier. And with that, we can just do a dry fit. We can see it fits in here nicely. It's snug. It slides really well. So with that being done, now it's time to move on to the actual forks. Now this piece here can be a little tricky, I think. So let's see what we can do with this piece. Well, this piece looks difficult, and in fact, Dutchy even says that you can consider making this out of 3 or 5 parts. I'm going to try to do it all in one shot. So what I have is I have a block of walnut. I have the grain running this way along the length of our piece for the best strength, and I have it cut to the proper length of 78 millimeters. Now it is much wider and much thicker than what we need, and that is to give us some room to work. So the very first thing I want to do is I want to treat this section right here as a dado. So I want to cut a dado that is 48 millimeters in width, and it will be 8 millimeters deep. It's going to be 16 millimeters from one end and 14 millimeters for the other. And I'm going to cut that dado over at the table saw. Now the next thing we want to do is we want to drill this hole right here. Now that is going to be on this surface, and it will only be at this end. What we're going to do is we're going to assume that we're going to get one of our pieces from this side and one of our pieces from this side of our block. So we can measure in the required distance here. In this case, it's 9 millimeters in, and we will measure in from the end, the center point. The distance is 6 millimeters in from the edge of our dado right there. So we'll measure in 6 millimeters here, and we're going to drill our 3 millimeter diameter hole. Well, we now want to cut these slots here. One of them is 8 millimeters in from this edge, and the other is 6 millimeters in from the edge. So what I have, guys, is I have this slot cutting bit at the router table, and we're just going to use some careful setup. My thickness of the slot bit is actually less than the 4 millimeters that we need. So I'm going to have to make multiple passes, but careful fence setup, careful router setup, and you can very easily get these slots cut. Now before we go any further, while you still have your router table set up, you just want to make sure that this is going to fit. That's a little snug. Oh, it's because I'm going on crooked. Never mind. All right, so there you go. This fits nice. It's nice and smooth on there. You can see that this is still loose. I haven't made the bottom brackets yet, and I haven't glued it in place. Everything's just dry fit. So your next step here that you want to do is you want to cut your pieces now over at the table saw to their final dimension of 18 millimeters wide and 18 millimeter thick. But you want to remember that when you cut them, we'll cut our width first, and then placing this edge against our fence, then we will cut our 18 millimeter thickness. All right, so we're just going to mark and sand this contour here. We're going to put this chamfer on here, give these pieces a good sanding. Guys, this is just sanding over at the belt sander. This can be done, this chamfer, with the miter gauge over at your table saw, and then those two pieces are done. The forks here, guys, are a very simple piece, all square cuts. Again, I don't think we really need a video on that. So get the forks cut, get the final shaping on this, and then we can glue our forks onto the assemblies that we just made, and then we can do the dry fit of our entire piece here. Now what we're going to need is a couple pieces of dowel that will get glued in place here. These are the pins that allow these forks to set in place without sliding on our mechanism. So we'll get that glued in as well. What we're going to do now is I have the brackets that will mount our lower end of our assembly here. The problem is, I mean, in the instructions it says to hold off on installing the wheels, and I got a little overzealous and I installed them anyway. But what it does is it creates a problem where you are kind of tight in here to be able to get this piece mounted with these brackets. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this back out of my way, and we're going to square these brackets up against the body tight to the edge of our frame where it's cut here. And once we get them glued, we're going to let them completely dry before we move on. And as far as these brackets goes, guys, just follow the dimensions on the plans, and you can mark them out carefully and cut them on the scroll saw. Well, those brackets are glued in and they're dried. We have our assembly here for the forks. We have some small pieces of dowel cut in the proper dimensions from the plans. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sit them in place here inside these holes, just flush with our opening. We'll set them in place where it goes here in the brackets. We're going to apply a little bit of glue, and then we'll slide these pieces in place to lock our assembly in place, and then clean up the squeeze out and let it dry. Once we get that done, we can glue in our front assembly just like this onto our shocks or our pistons here. Just something to keep in mind. It gets glued into this part, not into the shocks. It should be free floating in the shocks as far as I can tell. All right, and there we have our front fork assembly. That is all completed and good to go. We have it tilting forward and back. Guys, don't be afraid to add your own touches. Every forklift that I have ever had any kind of contact with was propane. So, of course, I turned a propane tank to go on the back end of it and added it to the model. If you want to change things up, don't be afraid to change things up. As well, don't be afraid to eliminate something from the model. While there is absolutely nothing wrong with Dutchy's plans, there is a little accent piece that goes right here and another little extra fender part that goes right here. And to be honest, when I looked at it, I didn't really like them on my model because it took away from my laser engraving here. So mine didn't really suit it, and I'm fine with that. I really like the way it turned out. But either way, guys, there we go. There is the forklift model. And I hope you're going to give this one a try, because this one, honestly, it was a load of fun. And there you have it. Dutchy Patterns Forklift build. Guys, this one here was an absolute load of fun. And I have to admit, it was a lot more challenging than what I thought it was going to be. I kind of chose this one because out of all of Dutchy's patterns, this one looked like it was the most simple to me. And it looked like the one that I could kind of bang off and, you know, do a few show episodes. I surely didn't expect it to last as many episodes as what it did, but I'm glad that it did because I learned quite a bit while doing this. And part of the thing that I learned here is what a pain you guys must go through converting my imperial measurements to metric, because for me to go back the opposite way from metric to imperial, or to mix and match in my case, it was really challenging. I mean, it really gave my brain a workout. Now, I'm lucky in that I have digital thickness gauges on my thickness planer. I also have digital calipers that I use in the shop, and I also have my digital readout on the fence of my saw stop, and all of those are convertible, are able to be converted to metric. So I was able to finagle things that way. But when it came to layout and marking, or, you know, even drilling holes, I had to rely on my eyesight and a metric ruler. And I gotta tell you, it's kind of difficult for me to read those little millimeters, but I'm happy with the results and I'm glad I gave this a try. And now, the other problem too, of course, was mixing and matching between metric and imperial. Where I don't have any metric drill bits, drilling the equivalent in imperial doesn't always work out. And that was the case with the rear of the forklift, where I had those 3/4 inch diameter headlights, and of course that didn't quite mesh with the other pieces, and I had to do some extra shaping to get everything to fit in place. Now guys, as I said in the last clip, don't be afraid to add or eliminate parts off the model. If you don't like them or you don't want to make them, then don't. It's as simple as that. There is no law and no rule that says that you need to make every part exactly as is prescribed by the plans. Speaking of which, these plans, Dutchy has done an absolutely incredible job with these plans. I've gone through them. I did not find a single mistake in these things. However, I found a couple missing measurements where maybe the diameter was missing from a hole or something like that. But that's minor stuff. I mean, you can scale off the drawings and get those dimensions. But as far as errors goes, I didn't find any. I design my own toys, guys, and I know what a pain in the neck it is to make the patterns. I don't really enjoy it, but I do it. And it's very challenging for me. It's almost difficult. I'm going to go borderline difficult. So I can't imagine what kind of a brain Dutchy has to think all this stuff through and make these patterns. Because honestly, this forklift is quite ingenious. Between the working steering and the raising and adjustable forks, everything about it is pretty darn cool. And honestly, guys, I hope you're going to give this one a try. So check out Dutchy's website and get yourself a set of these plans. Guys, I want to thank you so much for tuning into this series and for tuning into the show today. Now, I know I said this was going to be a Tuesday show, and you've all noticed that it's been on Friday. That was because of some scheduling mishaps. There was some gaps there that I just couldn't fill. And you know what? Really, this project is a woodworking project, so why not put it where it belongs? I just wasn't really willing to refilm the intro and the outro for every single video and then redo all the editing, re-upload, etc., etc. So unfortunately, it's mislabeled as a Tuesday show when it actually is a Friday show, but who's counting? If you haven't already, guys, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. You click the bell and then you're not going to miss notifications of the future episodes of the program. Guys, I hope you've enjoyed this series. I hope you're going to check out Dutchy's website and order yourself a set of plans. It doesn't have to be the forklift. He's got loads of plans there. I'm going to put the link below. And more importantly, guys, I hope you're going to join me again next week when I bring you yet another, not an alternative Tuesday, but another woodworking video.